And let me just start with a question. How many of you have been reading along in the Bible and you read a verse that's very familiar and you just keep right on going because you don't expect to see anything new there? That ever happened to you? On the other hand, how many of you have read a verse for the 100th time and all of a sudden something jumps off the page at you and it's like, I never saw that there before? Yes. Yeah, we can have both of those experiences. Now, my hope for this morning is that we can take a very fresh look at a very familiar passage and uncover some of the ways, the life-giving ways that God presents himself to us in this passage. And what we're going to do is look at some opening lines of the Sermon on the Mount, very famous, known for the Beatitudes. And so I'm going to focus on the first Beatitude. But let me just read the context around that first. And it says, when Jesus saw the multitudes, he went up to the mountain. And after he sat down, his disciples came to him. And opening his mouth, he began to teach them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Now, sometimes it's very hard for us to appreciate the impact these statements had on the listeners, because we're very far removed from their context. We don't quite understand what was going on in the mind of first century Jews, and partly just because we're too familiar with the verse, as we just mentioned. In fact, familiarity sometimes brings with it kind of a lot of assumptions that we make about the verse, and we just stop thinking about it, and we gather over time these little ideas about it that may not even have much to do with it. So before we get to the really good stuff, we're going to have to pull this apart a little bit, all right, and then we'll put it back together and make some sense out of it. But let's take a look at just a few of the terms. First of all, happy. Many of you have translations that say happy is the one who is meek. Happy is the one who hungers and thirsts for righteousness. Happy are the poor in spirit. Now, the problem with that is that happy and blessed are not the same thing at all. And I've got a bunch of translations at home, and when I pick one up and it says happy, I cross it out and put blessed. Okay, that's just me. See, happy is an emotion. Blessed is a condition of goodness in which we find ourselves. All right? I'm blessed to live in this country. I'm blessed to have more than enough food to eat. I'm blessed for having known the goodness of some very wonderful people. Now, I can be happy about those things too, but blessed is a whole lot more than that. It's about the richness of what I have. And in fact, blessed means that we have been given something of value. There's a man that's blessed. It might be friends, the BFF. Okay. Blessed is a condition of goodness. It might even be a loving family. Many of you have known that. It could be something as simple as time away in God's creation. Blessed always has this element of richness to it. It has something to do with what's going on in our life that is a gift to us, way beyond being happy. And then, of course, blessed is a condition of goodness when God pours good things into our lives. The healing and the restoration that he brings to us. And I think this is what Jesus is getting to. I'm going to tell you some things about which you're blessed that you might not even be aware of yet. Reasons that you might not even grasp yet. And he's going to tell them in just the next few sentences what some of those things are. But Jesus throws in a wrinkle. You see, one of the questions that we have to deal with is, what does it mean to be spiritually poor and blessed at the same time? You see, this statement, and we're going to see as we go along, is really a jarring proclamation to his listeners. And we'll see why in just a few minutes. So, blessed are the spiritually poor. Now, he's not talking about financially poor. He's talking about spiritual poverty. The second thing we want to notice is this is not a how-to statement. Now, some of our translations really imply that. They'll say something along the lines of, blessed is the person who knows they're spiritually poor. And the text doesn't say that. So Jesus isn't telling us how to get into the kingdom. He's just telling us good news. Blessed are you in spite of your spiritual poverty. He's not telling us how to get into the kingdom. He's announcing good news of the kingdom. There's a huge difference here. We need to shift away from this idea that the Bible's always telling us how to, and see more that often God is just painting a picture for us of what life with him looks like. Now, to kind of emphasize this, I've taken the liberty to paraphrase the first three Beatitudes to kind of emphasize this element of good news. The first one is, blessed are you who are poor in spirit, because the kingdom is here in spite of your condition. All right? Let's look at the next one. Blessed are you who are meek or gentle, because the earth doesn't go to the strongest and the most violent. See, that would be our natural inclination. Whoever's the biggest and strongest is going to win. And Jesus says, no. Blessed are you who are gentle. The earth belongs to you. And finally, blessed are you who are hungry and thirsty. Some of us think of this verse as, if I hunger and thirst enough, God will respond to that and fill me. And that may be true. But what Jesus is telling us here is, I want you to know that even though you feel like you're in a spiritual desert, I've got good news for you. The kingdom has food and water for your soul. All right? He's announcing that God's doing something new in the world. And that's really good news for people who feel maybe God had forgotten them. If you remember, the Jews had not heard anything from God in several hundred years. And they were wondering what was going on. So this is really good news. Now, what I want to point out here, again, is a very basic principle. We tend to read the Bible as a how-to book all the time. And there's plenty in there that tells us what we need to do. I'm not suggesting that's not true. But very often we read into the text that God's instructing us how to do something, when in fact, he's describing something good to us. We do this, let me give you a quick example. 1 Corinthians 13. Love is patient, love is kind. Love doesn't seek its own. And so when we read that, what do? I've got to be more patient. I've got to be more kind. I've got to do these things. Paul's not trying to tell us how to love. He's giving us a portrait of love so that we know what it looks like when we run into it. Okay? This is what love looks like. And in the context, he's talking about spiritual gifts. This is the kind of context we want to exercise spiritual gifts in. And he's not telling us how to love. He's telling us this is what this kind of person looks like. And so when Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit, he's not trying to tell us how to get into the kingdom by beating ourselves up or thinking we're really bad or whatever. He's simply trying to tell us good news. So let's rephrase this verse one more time in a way that sort of recaptures, I think, the spirit of what Jesus is telling us. Blessed are you who are spiritually impoverished, because you're exactly the ones God's kingdom is for. Now, is that good news or what? Now we begin to see how radical this really is. You see, the Pharisees had an entirely different worldview. Now, it's important that we don't dismiss the Pharisees as just a bunch of religious bigots. We kind of have that impression, and we think of them as the bad guys. But we need to realize that they were totally devoted to the restoration of Israel. This is what they were all about. Okay? They looked back at the history of Israel and they said, the reason we went into exile and the reason we've got foreign governments over us is because of all that idolatry and all that foolishness we engaged with for hundreds of years. And so their theory was, if we would just get pure enough, if we would just cleanse ourselves and follow the law to the T, God will come and rescue us. That will be what will usher in the Messiah. That's why they did all the stuff they did. Okay? And everybody knew that this is what they preached and believed. Now, chances are a lot of people just thought, you set the bar too high. I'm not going to be able to do those things. I've got a family to feed, and I got, crops to grow, and I haven't got time for all this highfalutin religious stuff that you're doing. So they kind of felt like the kingdom was just out of reach for them. Along comes Jesus and says, you don't have to get cleaned up to be in the kingdom. And I can just imagine the Pharisees saying, what are you saying? You can't go around telling these unclean people that God is going to establish his kingdom for them in their current condition. You're going to undo all the work we've been trying to do, and you're just making a mess out of things. But see, Jesus is determined to offer another possibility. He's telling us good news. And I'm going to say that there's good news about three major areas. First of all, it's good news about sin. When Jesus says, blessed are the spiritually impoverished, he means all of you who have holes in your life that you could drive a camel caravan through, all of you who have sin, all of you who have wounds and shortfalls and limitations, sins of commission, sins of omission, addictions, brokenness. See, this is good news about sin. And the first thing is that sin is not fatal. It's no longer fatal. Hopelessness and death are no longer the only possible outcomes. And the reason for that, and this is important, your deficiencies are no longer a barrier to God. Now, this is good news not just for the lost person. This is good news for the Christian. All right? God has decided to intervene on behalf of everyone who needs him. And that's true for us as well as non-Christians. See, there's a tremendous misunderstanding, I think, that is pervasive among Christians. That if I do something wrong, God's going to turn his back on me, and he's just going to wait until I figure out I've screwed up and come and beg him to forgive me, and then he'll come back and look at me again and have a conversation with me and have a relationship with me. I want you to know that's not true. God is not deterred by sin at all. I mean, a leper in the first century was the very icon. If you had an icon on their iPad in the first century for unclean, the icon would be a picture of a leper. That's exactly what unclean, there's like one and the same thing. When Jesus reached out and touched a leper, he told us something about how God views unclean. He doesn't wait for us to clean up and come to him. He reaches out and makes us clean. It's a lie. Sin does not separate you from God. It does not separate you from the work he wants to do in you. Blessed are the spiritually impoverished, because they get to be in the kingdom too. All right? This is important. Paul picks this up in Romans. If while we were look at this. He's talking both about non-Christians and Christians here. If while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God and formed a relationship with him through the death of Christ, how much more, already having a relationship with him, will we be rescued by his life within us? Okay? The rules don't change just because we become a Christian, and now we have to perform well for God. We still need cleaning, and it's his job to do that, and he's willing to do that. He wants to do that. He's speaking to every one of us, and he's offering us good news about the sin and brokenness that we all have. It's also good news about the kingdom. How many of you are familiar with the Left Behind series? You know, that made millions of dollars and built on completely faulty theology? All right? That's just for free. And I could spend a long time on that. But here's the point. The kingdom's already here. The kingdom is not some far-off future piece of geography that God is going to establish. And, maybe there is some of that. But that's not what Jesus came for. He didn't fail when he came here to set up the kingdom. He succeeded. He brought the kingdom. He inaugurated the kingdom. And most of the time when Jesus talked about the kingdom, he wasn't talking about anything about his second return. He was talking about what he was doing now. He was showing us what the kingdom looked like. Tom Wright has written a really cool book in the last few years called How God Became King. And it's a story. It's explained this is what the Gospels are all about. It's how Jesus became king. Now, a lot of times when we talk about this kingdom, people get a little confused. Okay, I don't see this kingdom you're talking about. What do you mean by kingdom of God? Well, if we compare this a little bit to an earthly kingdom, within certain boundaries, a certain realm, what the king says, what the king's will is, it gets carried out. See, the kingdom is the realm over which you have authority and over which what you want done is done. And so the kingdom of God is really the range of God's will, where it's being carried out. It's where God is overturning evil with good. Now for me, I was thinking about this one day, and it's like, I see a problem here. I mean, how many of you, we've all had maybe courses or heard things about what does it mean to be in God's will? How do you get to be in God's will? How do you find God's will for your life? All these things. Almost as if God's will is something that we need to discover or live up to. And so my question was, how can spiritually impoverished people be in God's will? Did you ever think about that? Here it says, spiritually impoverished people get to be in God's kingdom. Well, if you're all spiritually messed up, how's that in God's will? That can't be what he wants for you. But guess what? You know what God's will is? God's will is to restore. So everybody who's messed up qualifies. God's will is about what he wants to do in you. See, being in God's will is not something we achieve by being a good Christian. It's a process we submit to, allowing God to do in us and for us what we cannot do for ourselves. That's how you're in God's will. It's not something to live up to. It's not a big standard that you have to jump high. That's not how you get to be in God's will. See, God's kingdom is where we are going to be restored. Paul says, God rescued us from the kingdom of darkness, transferred us to the kingdom of his Son. Why? Because that's where he can do the work. See, it's like being pulled out of a toxic waste dump and taken to a place of health and cleanliness so you can heal. God's will is restoration. So when Jesus says, blessed are the spiritually impoverished, he's announcing really good news that God's going to do in us and for us what we'd never be able to do by our own effort. See, that's good news for Christians. That's not just good news for unsafe people. It's also good news about God. First of all, this was his idea. All right? God's not waiting for us to get our act together. He's actively taken the initiative to engage in us and do in us what we can't do, to grow us up. Among other things, God's going to do the work in us to change us from the inside out. We can't do that. See, when you become a Christian, God doesn't just wipe away the consequences of sin. His intent is to destroy the power of sin in your life, the causes for sin. And I mean both the sin done that we've done and the sin done to you, against you, that has been destructive. He doesn't just remove consequences. That has no power in and of itself. The power comes in actually transforming us from the inside out. All right. That's good news. God's intention is to restore us, not just pardon us. Now, when we take all these pieces together, good news about sin, good news about the kingdom, good news about God, I think we come up with a very interesting perspective. What Jesus is telling us here, in no uncertain terms, is that we get the relationship first, and then we work on the stuff. See, this is completely contrary to what the Pharisees taught. They thought we had to get cleaned up in order to convince God to respond to them. And there's a lot of Christians today who think that. A lot of Christians have been taught that. There's a lot of places where that's taught. That you have to get right with God. You have to do business with God. You have to promise never to do anything wrong again and try hard. But see, we don't have to clean up our act in order to have a relationship with God. We get the relationship first. And the relationship is the context within which God can do the cleaning. Okay? Now let's see how this worked out in the life of Peter. When he was at his absolute worst, Peter denied Jesus 3 times. Swore he never knew the man. I have no idea who that guy is. I have nothing to do with him. And he went out and sobbed. I imagine he cried for days. Broken. He went back to fishing. He felt like he was disqualified, probably. I know I felt that way at times. Maybe you can identify. But what happened? Did Jesus go, well, Peter, when you get your act together, you let me know? No. Jesus went to the shore, made breakfast, said, come here, Peter. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Let's reaffirm this 3 times. And let's heal what happened the other day. See, God doesn't abandon us when we fail. He seeks us out. He wants to restore it. He takes the initiative. Jesus comes to us, puts his hands around ours, and says, let's work on this. Let's see what we can do with your spiritually impoverished state and make some changes. Okay? Blessed are you who are spiritually impoverished. Blessed are you who've been rejected. Blessed are you who felt useless. Blessed are you who carry heavy regrets about what you did or didn't do. Blessed are you who have wished for another life because you don't like the one you've got. Blessed are you who are addicted. Blessed are you who are in bondage. Blessed are you who are depressed and have lost hope. Because none of this can separate you from God's intentions to do a good work in you. We have a God who has broken with all conventional wisdom and who embraces all of us regardless of how impoverished we might be. We get the relationship first. That's good news. Because God's love is much bigger than our brokenness, bigger than our flaws, and our life consists of a lot more than our brokenness. Jesus is announcing a new way of telling our story. Because only in the context of God's love and his will to restore us does our life even make any sense. It's a story of redemption in which God takes the initiative. And he will do in us what we cannot do. Blessed are we who have heard his voice and are being loved and restored by God.